My most beautiful hiding places, places that best fit my soul's deepest colors, are made of all that others forgot. They're solitary sites hollowed out in the grass's caress, in the shadow of wings, or in a passing song. Regions whose limits swirl with the ghostly carriages that transport the mist and the dawn, and whose skies are sketched with names, ancient words of love, vows burning like constellations of drunken fireflies. These are the opening words of a poem, Ballad of Forgotten Places, by the famous Argentine poem Olga Orozco. This poem speaks to me about places that are gems, special treasures, like this serene patch of land that I'm standing in right now. It's a place that communities have lost or are losing. This is Davis Cemetery. It's located on a rural road in eastern Leander, Texas. Now, Leander's always been a small town north of the Austin metro area. Until now. Folks are flocking in from all over the world to get a piece of Leander. The population is exploding. And yet here I stand in a cemetery that time has almost entirely forgotten. This was Leander's first cemetery. The town of Leander was not even established until the 1880s, but the earliest headstones here are from 1839. There are over 120 souls buried here, from 1839 to the most recent, Guy Maurice Wiley, who was laid to rest in 2003. There are 14 Wileys here. There are also 19 Davises and 10 Giddens, including a stillborn Giddens infant. In fact, there are several infants here and children here, including 4-year-old J.P. Willis and 1-year-old J.W. Willis, who both died in 1872. There are also 4 veterans, including Robert Allen, a Confederate cavalryman who passed away in 1916. So there are a lot of stories here, a lot of stories that are being forgotten. Now, we came here today to visit the earliest of these graves, and there's certainly quite a story with this one, a real humdinger piece of Leander's history, a story too few people in Leander actually know. Our story begins when a Virginian by the name of John Webster set out for God's country, the Republic of Texas, in 1837. John and his family, along with his friends and relatives, the Fletchers and Stillwells, traveled by way of the Ohio and Mississippi rivers to New Orleans, caught a boat to Matagorda, Texas, and some of this band of rugged pioneers traveled to Bastrop on the Colorado River, where they rented land and grew a crop of corn, which they could use to supply their party and also begin their own farms. They stayed there for about a year until John Webster bought some land north of the San Gabriel River to start a brand new community. Now, there are several different versions of what happened next. There are even different versions of who went on the journey. The 2 best eyewitnesses to these events are Dolly Webster, John Webster's wife, and Patsy Webster, their daughter, who was only 3 at the time. So I think Mama Dolly is the best source, and I'll try to stay true to her version, which she published a few years later with the help of Dr. Benjamin Dolbear. So the corn was harvested. John Webster bought 300 head of cattle, and the folks from Matagorda joined John at Bastrop. They were also joined by a Colonel Burleson and 100 military men. Now, some versions of the story have them setting off in June, but Dolly's version of a September trip makes a lot more sense because corn is usually an August crop. She says the party set forth from Bastrop at the end of September 1839. They traveled 50 miles past Austin, which, by the way, was not the capital of the Republic of Texas at that point, and they hit a little snag. Some, or perhaps all of the cattle, stampeded. Burleson and most of the men were forced to wrangle these feisty critters, while an advance party continued to their destination. And it's here we need to take stock of who was in that advance party. This is important because it seems there were only 17 of them. 17 hardy and bold pioneers in 2 wagons, with 13 men mounted. I think if we're going to paint a proper picture here, it's important to put names to our actors. By piecing together evidence from Dolly, Patsy, the Davis Cemetery, and other various sources, including an interview of at least one Native American historian, who presumably got his information from the oral history of the Comanches, here's the list that I have compiled. There were the Websters, John, Dolly, Patsy, who was variously called Martha in Virginia, and 10-year-old Booker, the boy. The Websters brought along a young Negro servant named Nelson. John Stillwell was still with them, all the way from Pennsylvania. So were the Fletchers, who, according to Patsy and Dolly, were related to the Websters. There was an uncle and a nephew. By the way, some sources call these folks the Fleshers, not the Fletcher. There were two Reeses, William Parker, who went by William, and Washington Perry, who went by Perry. There were 6 more young white men looking for land and opportunity. There was Milton Hicks, Albert Silsby, a Mr. Baylor, a Mr. Beasley, and a Mr. Morton, and a W. Penny. There was also one young Mexican man also looking for a chance to settle down. His name was Antonio. These folks were in 2 heavily laden ox-pulled wagons, piled high with supplies, survey and construction equipment, and ammunition. The group traveled until they ran into a Native American problem on September 30th. Dolly's version of the story says that some of the men went ahead to hunt and to scout ahead, and when they came to a creek they heard Indian voices, so they retreated to tell the others and warn them. There was a debate that ensued. John wanted to go forward and talk to the Indians and see what their intentions were, but cooler heads prevailed, and they decided to turn around and retreat to meet their military escort. So now it's time to introduce the other characters in our story, the Comanches of the time of the Texas Republic. According to Rocky Stallings, an Indian historian and an expert on the Comanche, there were 3 Pinnataka Comanche chiefs in charge of the territory west of Austin during the years of the Texas Republic: Yellow Wolf, Buffalo Hump, and Guadalupe, who was also known as Mukuwaru. As you can see from this map, what we call Central Texas now, the hill country around the capital, was the frontier in 1839, a frontier where the Comanches were on the warpath. Why were they so mad? The first president of the Republic of Texas, the incomparable Sam Houston, expressed faith in the Native Americans. He felt that there could be peace, and he sought it with councils, treaties, and dialogue. Of course, he was not naive. He had created the legendary Texas Rangers as early as 1823, and the Rangers were expanded with the independence of the Republic and sent out to protect the frontier, while a relatively peaceful period did occur. Then a series of events led us to that fateful fall day in 1839. First, the more hostile and more aggressive Pinnataka Comanches expanded their range of influence from West Texas towards Austin. Now this led to Sam Houston losing the presidential election of 1838 to Mirabeau Lamar, who had run on a platform of Indian extermination. He was true to his campaign, and he met the Pinnataka aggressiveness with an ever-increasing number of regular troops led by our aforementioned Colonel Burleson. Into this already fiery environment, we must add the Mexican government, who were not thrilled with Comanche attacks along the Rio Grande and did not recognize the independence of the interloping white man claiming to run the Republic of Texas. They cleverly sought to solve both problems by paying the Comanche 5 pesos for every enemy of Mexico, yes, Texians, that they killed. So yeah, the Comanches that our party of 17 encountered were dangerous. They'd been rampaging across the territory, kidnapping and killing for quite a while now. So back to our story. Once cooler heads had prevailed, they decided to turn around, and they drove very hard through the night. Apparently too hard. Early in the morning of October 1st, 1839, as they traveled through some heavy timber and were crossing a ravine, an axle on one of their wagons broke. Maybe things would have turned out the same even without the broken axle, but maybe not. The Indians soon took advantage of the situation, and a dozen or more of the Comanche attacked the settlers. The 13 brave men mounted on horses bravely chased off the warriors, and brave but perhaps not too smart. The Indians wanted their enemy to chase them right into a couple of hundred Comanche. The Webster party did what they could. One of the Reeses had them pull the wagons close side by side for some protection, but it didn't really matter. Surrounded and outnumbered by hundreds of Indians using the heavy timber for cover, they never really stood a chance. First, Antonio tried to escape, and he was killed. Dolly saw this, and then she saw the others fall one by one around her. Mr. Morton, Perry Reese, her husband John, then Mr. Baylor, and the others, until only Silsby and Hicks were fighting to protect the family. They too were killed.
leaving only Dolly and her 2 children.
And then the scalping began. The Indians refused to take John Webster's scalp because it was blanco, 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 all white. John Stillwell was bald, so he didn't get scalped, but all the other dead were scalped, and Dolly Webster fainted straight away. She was revived when they began raping her. Booker, Patsy, and Dolly were then taken away. And the depredations that they suffered over the next several months are another story and definitely for another time.
Several days later, some of the stock, probably the oxen, wandered into Horton Bend with Webster's brand and Comanche arrows. A party immediately went in search of the pioneers and came to the massacre site, where they found the mutilated bodies that were really only skeletons now. The coyotes and the vultures had been busy. The search party was not large. They were afraid the Comanches might still be nearby, so they quickly buried all the men inside one of the burned wagon beds in a single mass grave. So here we are. This memorial within the Davis Cemetery marks the spot where the victims of the Webster Massacre are buried. There are 2 other markers here of note, one for William Parker Reese and one for Washington Perry Reese. The headstone for William reads, "Killed with John Webster and accompanied by Comanche Indians." This tomb was raised by their brother and Webster's daughter, Martha E. Strickling, Charles K. Reese, and Thomas Reese. Perry's is more or less the same. So these headstones, placed by the brothers of the Reese brothers, before even the historical marker was placed, are the oldest gravestones here. Now, the text of the historical marker is interesting itself. It says, "Here sleep the victims of the Webster Massacre of August 27, 1839. About 30 homeseekers headed by John Webster en route to what is now Burnett County were attacked by a band of Comanche Indians. After attempting to flee under the cover of darkness, they were trapped in this vicinity. Mrs. Webster and her 2 children were captured and later released. All the others were killed. Martha Webster, then but 3 years old, was later married to Marmaduke Strickland." Let's see, no source I've researched puts the count of the victims that high. Martha, or Patsy as we have known her, visited here and declared the date to be wrong, and Dolly disagrees with the date as well. Also, when it says that Mrs. Webster and her 2 children were later released, that's not accurate and very, very generous. Again, another story for another time. Now, one last thread we need to pull here can be seen on both the marker and the gravestones. It involves our dear 3-year-old Patsy. Don't you find it odd that a historical marker would state, "Martha Webster, then but 3 years old, was later married to Marmaduke Strickland"? I pulled on that thread and did find out why the statement was both interesting and locally important. I found out what I could about the fates of Booker and Patsy. Booker became a soldier, and he was killed at Monterey during the Mexican-American War. As it says, Patsy married an Easterner, Marmaduke Strickland. Well, they call him Strickland here. The Reese grave markers call him Strickling with an E at the end. Here locally, he would have been known better as Marmaduke Strickling without an E. It seems that Patsy, or Martha because that was her grown-up name, returned to Texas and claimed the land that John Webster had bought in 1839, the land that led to her father's death, and founded the town of Strickling in 1853 on that land. Strickling is about 25 miles as the crow flies from the site of the Webster Massacre.
That doesn't seem all that far today, but in 1839 that was 14 lives far. Thank you.